there is a huge risk of correlation being a privacy risk, because payments that can be correlated back to an individual can leak the identity of the individual itself. And so one way of thinking about it is, traceability in a blockchain network is quite often a good thing. Like what the picture that I'm showing to you is what happened on the Poly network hack. So if you didn't hear this news story, this is a couple of I think about a month ago at this point, when this, I think, DApp of some kind called Poly network got hacked. They lost crypto to the tune of about $600 million. But when the hacker for this particular hack tried to extract it out, there were people who had visibility on where every single payment was flowing within minutes and hours. This is a graph of how those payments flow through. And what you find is because the on-ramps and off-ramps to crypto are often KYC'd and regulated, it's very hard to get away with something like that. So that sort of traceability on a blockchain is quite nice. But this is where the challenge starts happening. When you then start mixing the concept of the identity of an individual or an identifier for an individual with payments, there can be a lot of problems with correlation. So to take an example, if you think of the Ethereum name service, the Ethereum name service is something, if you haven't heard of it, you can get something like a domain name. So you can have an identifier. So I could have anchor.eth and say that is linked to this particular Ethereum wallet address. So if you think of the challenge here is yes, it makes life simpler. Now it's easier for me to remember if somebody wants to pay me or if somebody wants to transfer an NFT to me, then they don't have to remember a very long hexadecimal string. They have a very easy alias through which they can address me the same way that we have domain names. But the problem also therefore is if you use something like ENS for any kind of identity payments or identity transactions, then there's a correlation risk, because anytime, even if you have a cold wallet of some sorts that is not necessarily linked to an Ethereum name service address, if at any point you carry out a transaction with that particular address, it can all be correlated back. So how are we thinking of getting around the specific problem of how there's a risk of the privacy of the individual being leaked? And for example, actually to bring up the other one, you could have, for instance, an issuer who prices a credential very precisely to say 8 decimal points, and then keep a record on their side that if a payment comes through for this exact amount, I know that credential belongs to Anka Banerjee or to Alex Tudel. So even if you have the ability to say there's an atomic payment that is happening, but it is not actually linked to an identifier for you on a ledger, there can be ways, and perhaps the issuer can correlate this back. And so one of the ways that we've been thinking about this is to not necessarily make atomic payments for every single individual transaction, especially because of that risk where the issuer of a credential could price this very precisely and then correlate back. But to think of this as maybe a net settlement model. And one of the examples that I bring over here is something called TransferWise. They've now rebranded to Wise, and they created a system where you can transfer money cheaply across different borders and between different currencies. But the way they actually do it is for every individual payment, say Jane wants to send £500 to the £500 to USA, and the recipient has to get it in dollars, they're not actually carrying out that exchange atomically for every single transaction. What they're essentially doing is they have a balance which is maintained in pounds in a country, and a balance which is maintained in dollars in another country, and they essentially net it out. So there are people from the US, say, trying to transfer money to the UK. That comes out of the UK pound balance. And there are people who want to get paid, say, in dollars in the US. That comes out of the US balance, and then that can be automatically settled. And yes, you're absolutely right. Like ACH in the US does exactly this. Most banking systems around the world, when you think of like how banks actually transfer money across each other, they're not literally transferring, say, if I send £10 to Alex, they're not literally sending it across every single time. What they're doing is they're using a clearinghouse model where they're effectively netting out the payments between different providers. And by creating a payment model, perhaps where say if the verifier or the receiver of a credential has to pay an issuer, but they're not atomically paying it per transaction, but there's a netting system that is being used. The fact that payments are being made in aggregate between the verifier and the issuer could be one way of ensuring that the privacy of the individual is maintained. Now, what's quite important here, of course, is ensuring that the way that the revocation status is handed out is also done in a privacy-preserving fashion, because if it's the issuer holding on to that revocation log, they can regardless see which verifier reached out to them. So it shouldn't necessarily sit with the issuer themselves. Like there have to be privacy-preserving revocation mechanisms that are used. But if I, as an issuer, know for a fact that there's this system in the middle that will ensure that I am paid what I'm due, but it is carrying out those actions in aggregate, then we can solve some of that problem, which comes across if you're trying to make payments directly for that specific transaction. Now, one thing also I want to clarify there is we don't necessarily think that like a verifier paying an issuer is the only model that exists, because there could be other scenarios. For instance, I pay £60 to get a passport. So if somebody wants a copy of my passport, then as the holder of the credential, maybe they should pay me. Whereas in some other scenarios, you might have a system where the verifier pays the issuer directly. So it's not to say, I don't think like the right answer when trying to think of commercial models in SSI is to say that is the only way it can work. I think it needs to be flexible enough, because identity ecosystems are quite different around the world. And within an ecosystem, say, for instance, the cost of a KYC check in the UK is very, very different from, say, a company file in the US or an insurance file in the US. And that's very different from, say, maybe the cost of a boarding pass in Singapore. And maybe perhaps, very different from what should be the cost associated with, verifying this is an authentic Glastonbury concert ticket. So I don't think like, a single model saying that like only verifier paying an issuer or only the verifier paying a holder are the needs to be dictated across the network. I think like the system or the mechanism itself needs to be flexible enough to account for various different economic models that come up across the world.